The nail went in crooked. Garrett Finch pulled it out, turned it between his fingers and drove it back in again. Straight this time. He moved to the next post, then the next. The fence along the eastern edge of his property had been sound for 3 years. He had checked it last Tuesday. He would check it again next Tuesday. The neighbors knew this. Ruthie knew this. Even the old dog Thomas seemed to know this because he never followed Garrett on these particular mornings. He simply watched from the porch with the patient expression of an animal that understood grief better than most people did and had the wisdom not to comment on it. This was not about the fence. The sky above Dry Creek, Wyoming was the color of a tin plate left out in winter. Pale, flat, tired. The kind of sky that offered nothing and asked nothing in return, which suited Garrett fine because he had grown accustomed to transactions that cost him nothing and gave him the same. He had grown used to that kind of sky the way a man grows used to a bad knee or a drafty window. You stopped noticing it. Then one morning you noticed nothing else. He was 40 years old that autumn, though people in town often guessed older. Not because he looked worn exactly. It was more the way he carried himself. Deliberate, measured, like a man who had learned through specific and painful experience that the ground could give way without warning, and had concluded that the only reasonable response was to step lightly on all of it, always forever just in case. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, hands mapped with the small scars of rope work and iron and winter, and eyes the quiet color of a November sky just before snow. Not cold, just waiting, the way a man's face goes when he has learned that the next thing coming is rarely better than the last. The ranch was called the Double Ridge. 60 acres of short grass and pale dirt, a creek that ran honest in spring and argumentative by August, a barn that had been needing paint for 2 years and would probably need it for 2 more, and a cabin that was too large for 2 people and far too large for 1. He had built the extra room himself the first summer of his marriage. He had done it on a Saturday in July with his sleeves rolled up and Eleanor sitting on an overturned bucket nearby, reading aloud to him from a novel she had ordered from a catalog. He could not remember now what the novel had been about. He remembered the sound of her voice. He remembered the way she occasionally stopped reading to make a comment about a character she found unconvincing, and the way those comments were always correct. He had never found a reason to tear the extra room down. Inside the cabin on the table near the window, a drawer sat open 2 inches. He had not meant to open it that morning. He had been looking for the deed to the north pasture which his neighbor Amos Tilbert had been asking about with the polite persistence of a man who wanted something and had decided that patience was his most effective tool. Garrett had pulled the drawer open, moved aside a folded survey map, a receipt from the feed store dated 3 springs ago, a broken pocket watch he had been meaning to have repaired since the year Eleanor died. His hand had moved through these ordinary objects with the automatic efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he owned and where he kept it. Then his fingers found the paper. It was small, folded twice, the crease lines gone soft with age, torn at the upper right corner in the way of paper that had been handled too quickly by someone in a hurry. He recognized it the moment he touched it, the way you recognize a voice before the words become clear. He did not need to open it. He had opened it so many times in the first months after Eleanor's death that the words had burned themselves into the back of his eyelids. He had seen them in the dark. He had turned them over in his mind while writing fence lines and eating supper alone and lying awake in the hours between midnight and dawn when the cabin made its small sounds and he had no one to tell him that they were ordinary. He unfolded it anyway. Eleanor's handwriting. Small, careful letters, each one placed deliberately like a woman building something she intended to last. Even in haste, which this clearly had been, she had not let the letters collapse into each other. She had held them steady. "Do not trust Hollis Brand. He knows what I found." 9 words. He had read them perhaps 1,000 times across 5 years. He had turned them over like a stone under which he expected to find something and never did. In the beginning, in the fog and weight of the first year, he had told himself it was nothing. Eleanor had worried. Not excessively, not in the way people said when they meant a woman was irrational. She worried in the specific and attentive way of someone who paid close attention to the world and therefore noticed more of what was wrong with it. He had loved her for that. He had also, in moments he was not proud of, found it wearying. He had wanted sometimes to come home to a quiet evening without a concern to untangle. He had wanted sometimes to simply rest. She had come to him 3 days before she died. He had been at the kitchen table with the account books wrestling with numbers that refused to cooperate, and she had sat down across from him with an expression he had catalogued at the time as serious without being alarmed, and had since re-examined approximately 10,000 times. She had folded her hands on the table the way she did when she had made a decision and was checking to see if it still felt correct. She had said, "I think Hollis Brand is doing something wrong, something that hurts people. I have been trying to find out more, and I think I have found something real." He had put his pencil down. He had looked at her. He had said, "Eleanor, you worry too much." She had held his eyes for a moment that he now understood was longer than it had seemed at the time, a moment in which she was deciding something, whether to say more, whether to press, whether the person across the table was ready to hear what she was carrying. Then she had nodded once, the small private nod of a woman who has received an answer she was not surprised by, and she had gone back to the kitchen. He had gone back to the numbers. 3 days later, she was dead. Her horse had thrown her on the northern trail. She had struck her head on a rock. She had not survived. The animal had been found standing at the fence line, calm, showing no sign of the panic that was said to have caused the accident. Garrett had noted this at the time with the numb observation of a man too deep in shock to know what observations were worth keeping. He had filed it away somewhere and not returned to it. He was returning to it now. He folded the note back along its original lines. He placed it in his shirt pocket against his chest and stood there in the kitchen for a moment with the drawer still open and the morning light coming through the window at the angle that was different in autumn than in any other season, lower and more direct, the kind of light that showed the dust on everything. He went back outside. He drove another nail, then another. The fence line did not need him. He needed the fence line. The sound of boots on the porch steps brought him around. Ruthie was coming along the side of the cabin with her dark hair pulled back and the small leather notebook tucked under her arm that she carried, the way other women carried a handkerchief, automatically always, as though she might need it at any moment. She was 22 years old and had arrived at the Double Ridge 3 years ago after their mother passed, intending to stay for a few months while she decided what came next. She had never mentioned leaving. Garrett had never mentioned wanting her to. They had arrived at an arrangement that neither of them had explicitly agreed to, and both of them understood completely. She stopped beside him and looked at the fence post without commenting on it. "There was a man on the eastern trail this morning," she said. "Same horse as Tuesday, brown with a dark saddle band. He stayed at the top of the rise. Didn't come down toward the ranch. Could be a traveler resting his horse. He faced the road into town, not the ranch. He wasn't looking at us. He was watching who came and went on the main road." She opened her notebook and looked at something written there. "He was there for about 40 minutes. Then he left the same way he came." Garrett straightened and looked toward the eastern trail. Empty now, just pale grass and the low gray sky and the distant line of cottonwoods along the creek. "When did you start keeping that notebook?" he asked. "The week after Eleanor's funeral." She said it simply, without drama, the way she said things that were true and heavy and not in need of decoration. "I decided that people I loved were not going to be caught off guard again. Not if I could prevent it. Not if paying attention was enough." He looked at his sister. He thought about what that had cost her, 3 years of watching, noting, cataloging. He thought about a 22-year-old woman sitting alone, deciding that the world had failed to warn them once and would not fail to warn them again if she had anything to say about it. He did not say any of this. He turned back to the fence. "Be careful on the eastern trail," he said. "I'm always careful," she said. She walked back toward the cabin. After a moment she stopped and said without turning around, "May is coming. I can see her wagon on the south road." May Sutton arrived at 9:30, as she did every Monday morning, as she had done every Monday morning for 5 years without exception, including the Monday 3 years ago when a late October blizzard had closed the main road and she had come the long way around through the Tilbert property, adding 40 minutes to the journey without mentioning it to anyone. She carried a covered dish that moved the air ahead of it with the authority of cornbread and something slow cooked in a deep pot, and she set it on the kitchen table and removed the cover with the decisive gesture of a woman who knew the value of what she was delivering. She was 68 years old, broad in the shoulders, narrow in her opinions, with gray hair in a practical braid, and a face that had passed through pretty many years ago and arrived somewhere more permanent and interesting. She had run the only eating establishment in Dry Creek worth the name for 30 years. She knew everyone in the county remembered everything she had ever been told, and had the quality rare and somewhat unnerving of seeming to know things she had not been told. Garrett had asked her once in the second month after Eleanor's death why she kept bringing food every Monday. He had asked in the clumsy way of a man who is trying to refuse kindness without appearing ungrateful, which is to say, he had not done it particularly well. She had looked at him with an expression that suggested the question reflected a certain poverty of imagination, and said simply, "Because it is the right thing to do." He had not asked again. He had come to rely on it in the way he relied on the creek running and the sun rising and the other quiet constants of a life that had lost several of its larger ones. She moved through the kitchen now with the comfort of a woman in a space she knew. She checked the stove. She looked at the water level in the large pot. She opened the back door, briefly assessed the woodpile through the screen, and closed it again. Then she turned and looked at Garrett with the particular quality of attention she occasionally directed at him, the kind that felt like being read rather than looked at. Her eyes moved to the open drawer, to the 2 bowls on the shelf above the dry sink, which had sat there since Eleanor arranged them and which Garrett had never relocated, to the second chair at the table with its slight angle, which Eleanor had preferred because it let her see both the door and the window at once, and which had not been moved since the last time she sat in it. Then May looked at him. "You found it," she said. He went still. "Found what?" She turned back to the stove and adjusted the covered pot with small, unnecessary movements. "Whatever it is you've been almost ready to find for a while now." She did not look at him. Eleanor was a smart woman, Garrett, smarter than people gave her credit for, smarter than she was given time to prove. "May, I'm just saying what's true." She covered the pot. She moved toward the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back, and her expression was different now, less certain, something in it that had been kept a long time and had grown heavy with keeping. She saw things clearly. When she told you something was real, it was real. She held his eyes for a moment. "I hope you know that. I hope you have always known that." He thought about 9 words in careful handwriting. He thought about a woman sitting across from him at this table, hands folded, eyes clear, telling him something was real. He thought about what he had said in return. May left without saying anything more. He stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of her wagon had faded down the south road. Then he took the note out of his shirt pocket and placed it on the table in front of him and looked at it. "Do not trust Hollis Brand." Hollis Brand, who ran the largest trading concern in Dry Creek and had done so for 20 years, who sat on the town council and the church committee and the board that oversaw the water rights for the whole Eastern Valley, who had attended Eleanor's funeral in a dark suit with a hat held over his heart and eyes that had looked genuinely like a man in grief, who had shaken Garrett's hand at the graveside and said in a low and careful voice that Eleanor had been a remarkable woman and that her loss was felt by everyone who had known her. Garrett had believed him. He was less certain now of what he had believed. That evening after supper, Ruthie placed a folded newspaper in front of him at the table. Her finger rested on a small advertisement near the back of the page. He read it. He looked at her. She said, "You are fading." Not loudly, not in a way that makes people worry, just quietly like a fire that isn't being fed. Eleanor would not have wanted that. You know she wouldn't. He looked back at the advertisement. Brides sought. Honest ranchers, quiet lives, new beginnings. "I'm 40 years old," he said. "I'm aware of your age." "It seems late." "It seems like an excuse." She took her notebook out and opened it to a blank page, set it beside the newspaper, and placed a pencil next to that. Then she went to bed without another word. He sat at the table for a long while. The fire burned down. Thomas moved in his sleep in the corner. The note sat beside the notebook beside the newspaper. 3 pieces of paper that between them contained something he was not entirely sure he was ready to name. He picked up the pencil. He wrote the letter slowly, stopping several times to consider a word, crossing out 2 full sentences and rewriting them. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to be honest, which he had found was harder to do in writing than it appeared. He wrote that he was a widower with a working ranch in Wyoming. He wrote that he was not an easy man to know, but tried to be a fair one. He wrote that he had a sister who would form an opinion immediately and a dog who would not bother forming one at all. He wrote that he was looking for a person who wanted a real life in a real place and was not afraid of either. He did not write that he was starting from the wrong end of grief. He did not write that the woman who had sat across from him at this table had known something he had failed to understand in time. He did not write that he was picking up the pencil partly because he needed to become the kind of man who acted instead of waited, because waiting had cost him something he could not get back. He sealed the envelope. He set it by the door. He went to bed. He put his hand on Eleanor's side of the mattress in the dark, as he still did, sometimes not out of sentimentality, but out of habit that had become its own kind of memorial. The cabin was quiet. The note was on the table. He closed his eyes. He did not know yet what was coming. He knew only that he had stopped waiting, and that stopping felt like stepping off a ledge he had been standing on for 5 years, and that the falling was going to be its own education. The rain began before dawn and had not reached any conclusion by the time the stage rolled into Dry Creek at 11:30. Garrett stood on the boardwalk outside the stage office in his better coat, which was not significantly better than his ordinary coat, but had fewer visible repairs. In his left hand he held a small bundle of wild prairie grasses that Ruthie had cut from the creek bank early that morning and set on the table next to his coffee without commentary. He had looked at them. He had looked at her. He had said that it seemed like a great deal of ceremony for a first meeting with a stranger. She had said, "It seems like the least a person can do." He had taken the grasses. He was holding them at his side now in a way he hoped communicated that he had not selected them personally. The rain moved in slow diagonals across the empty street. A dog had been sitting at the corner of the dry goods store when Garrett arrived, but had since reconsidered. The town had the subdued quality it always had on wet weekdays. Its sounds muffled and its distances compressed, everyone who could be indoors being indoors. He heard the stage before he saw it, the particular percussion of that many hooves on wet-packed earth, the driver's voice carrying faintly over the rain. Then it came through the gray curtain of the morning, the horses blowing hard steam rising off their backs, the whole apparatus arriving with the purposeful clatter of something that had somewhere to be and had gotten there. The door opened. She stepped down with one hand on the frame and tested the ground before she committed her weight to it. A small action, automatic. The kind of thing a person does without thinking when they have learned through experience that the next surface might not be what it appears. She had a bag over one shoulder and a trunk being handed down behind her by the driver, and she wore a dark coat that was well made and well used, and a hat with a brim she had pulled low against the rain. Then she lifted her head. Her eyes moved across the street to the left, then to the right, then up to the roof line of the stage office, then to the narrow alley between the stage office and the building beside it. All of this happened in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, smooth and unhurried, the survey of a person who has made a habit of understanding a space before deciding how to occupy it. Then her eyes found him. She went still, not frozen, still, the way water goes still. He would think about that later, the sequence of it, the street before the man, the exits before the welcome. He would think about what kind of life a person had to have lived for that sequence to become natural. She crossed to him through the rain without hurrying. Up close she was younger than he had somehow imagined, with brown eyes that held a steadiness disproportionate to the circumstances and a quality to her face that was not quite calm and not quite tension, but something that lived in between, like a door held mostly closed, like a person who had selected an expression and was maintaining it with intention. "Mr. Finch," she said. "Miss Kane." He held out the grasses. "These are from my sister. I want that to be clear." She looked at them. Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was the beginning of the architecture of one. She took them and held them carefully, the way you hold something unexpectedly given. "How old is your sister?" she asked. 22. "She sounds like a person with good instincts." "She has excellent instincts and very little patience for people who ignore them." He took her bag from her shoulder before she could object. "The trunk will follow. The wagon is this way." They walked through the rain to where he had left the horses tied. He helped her up without being asked, which seemed to surprise her slightly, and then felt in a small way that he had done it wrong. Like it was assistance she had learned not to expect, and therefore did not entirely know how to receive. He filed that away without examining it closely. The ride to the double ridge took 40 minutes on a dry road. It took 50 in the rain. They talked about practical things which suited both of them as far as he could tell. The size of the ranch, the winter preparation still needed the 2 horses he kept, whose names were Idiot and Senator, for reasons that had made sense at the time. He told her about Thomas the dog, who was 15 and considered vigorous activity beneath his current station. She listened to all of this and asked clear and specific questions and did not fill the pauses between his answers with sounds that meant nothing. He found the pauses easy. This was not something he had expected. Ruthie was on the porch when they pulled in, sitting with her notebook open on her knee and her expression in its default position, which was attentive without being warm, interested without being welcoming. She looked at Nora for a long moment. Nora looked back at her without flinching, which Garrett noted was the correct instinct. Ruthie stood up and held the door open. "You must be cold," she said. "Come in." She did not offer her hand. For Ruthie, holding the door was the equivalent of a formal greeting and a letter of reference combined. Nora seemed to understand this, or at least to sense it. She thanked her and went inside, and Garrett watched his sister watch the woman walk into their home with the careful appraisal of someone cataloging data for future reference. Inside the cabin was warm. May had been and gone, and the smell of what she had left on the stove moved through the rooms with a kind of insistence that Garrett associated with being cared for. Nora stepped in and stood for a moment just past the threshold, and he watched her do what she had done on the street in town. Her eyes moved over the room, not nosily, methodically. She noted the 2 doors, the single window in the main room, the placement of the furniture. Then her eyes found the shelf above the dry sink where 2 bowls sat that Eleanor had placed there and where they remained. They moved to the second chair at the table with its slight angle. They moved to the shelf above the fireplace where the blue pitcher stood that had stood there for years and would stand there, Garrett suspected, until the cabin itself was gone. She did not comment on any of it. She turned to him and asked where she could wash up. He showed her the room. She went in. He closed the door quietly and stood in the hallway for a moment before returning to the kitchen. Ruthie was already there, kettle on notebook on the table, pencil in hand. She checked the exits, Ruthie said, not looking up. "I noticed." She was careful getting off the stage. Tested the ground. "I wasn't there, but I would have put money on it." She wrote something in the notebook. "She knows how to read a room. She could just be observant." Ruthie looked up. "So can I. There's a difference between the observant and the watchful. Observant people notice things that interest them. Watchful people notice things that might hurt them." She looked back down. "She's watchful." He did not argue with this. He pulled out his chair and sat down and let the kettle take its time. The first 3 days at the Double Ridge established a rhythm that no one had planned and everyone seemed to find acceptable. Nora rose before Garrett each morning. The first day he came to the kitchen to find coffee already made, and her outside in the gray pre-dawn light, standing at the fence line looking east with her arms crossed and her breath making small clouds in the cold. He brought her a cup. She accepted it with both hands and did not speak, and he stood beside her and did not speak, and after a while they went inside and started breakfast, and that was that. The second morning she replaced a board on the barn wall. He discovered this by coming around the corner to find her midway through the job, the old board already pulled free, and the new one measured and cut her movements economical and assured the hammer doing exactly what it was asked. He stood watching her for longer than he meant to. There was something in the precision of it, not just competence, the particular competence of someone who had learned to be useful quickly and thoroughly because circumstances had not always allowed for a slower pace. He brought her coffee. She took one long drink and handed the cup back without stopping work entirely. "The east wall has 3 more boards that will go bad before spring," she said. "I can do them this week." "All right," he said. He walked back to the house. He was 12 steps away when he noticed that he had been smiling. Not at anything in particular, not at her or the barn or the cold gray morning, just smiling the way a person smiles at something unexpectedly correct. He stopped in the yard and stood there for a moment, faintly surprised at himself. He had not felt that in a while. The light way of it, the smallness and sufficiency of it. He walked inside. He did not mention the smiling to anyone. The evenings were quiet in a different way than he was used to. Ruthie generally took herself and her notebook to the chair by the fire after supper. Thomas occupied the rug with the full commitment of an animal who had decided that warmth was his primary purpose. Nora washed the dishes in the manner of a person who preferred to do something with her hands when she was thinking. Garrett usually found himself remaining at the table longer than he had in years, not because there was anything requiring his presence, but because the room had changed quality in a way he had not anticipated. It was not lonelier than before. It was noticeably less so. The cabin that had been too large for one person was accommodating 3 and a dog without effort, and the sounds it made were different now. Small domestic sounds, a cup set on a shelf, a page turned the fire doing its slow work. He sat with these sounds and did not examine them too closely. On the 4th evenings after Ruthie had gone to bed and Thomas had achieved his maximum state of repose, Garrett found himself remaining at the kitchen table while Nora made a second cup of tea. The fire had burned to a comfortable depth of coals. The rain had stopped. The night outside the window was the particular quality of black that Wyoming nights achieved in autumn, absolute and very clean. She sat down across from him, both hands around her cup. She looked at the blue pitcher on the shelf for a moment before she spoke. "The pitcher was hers," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what was she like? He thought about this honestly, which was different from how he usually answered this question, which was to construct a response that was true but reduced. True the way a map is true, accurate in its proportions, and useless for understanding the actual ground. "She saw things before they happened," he said. "Not in any strange way. She was simply more attentive than most people. She noticed what was real, and she did not talk herself out of it." He put his hand flat on the table. He looked at the window. He looked at the fire. Outside, the clouds had settled into the flat gray they would maintain for the rest of the day, and the frost was gone from the grass, and the eastern trail was empty in the particular way that no longer felt like nothing. Nora was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely interpret, something in it that was recognition, something that knew the inside of what he had said, not just the outside. "People like that are rare," she said, "and they are often the loneliest people in a room, because they see something true and look around and find that no one else has seen it yet." He looked up. She was not looking at him now. She was looking at the pitcher. Her voice had been level when she said it, the voice of someone describing a general truth, not a personal one. But her hands had tightened slightly on her cup. He did not say, "Is that you?" He thought it clearly and with some force. He did not say it. The fire settled. Thomas sighed in his sleep. She looked back at him. She said, "Thank you for the room, for not demanding more explanation than I've given. I have questions. I know you do. I'm waiting for the right time to ask them." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at her cup. Something in her shoulders changed. Not relaxation exactly. More like the slight careful release of a tension that had been held at a fixed level for a long time. "My name is Nora Kane," she said. "That's what you need to know for now. The rest of it is real. I just need a little more time before I bring it in here." A pause. "I don't mean that to sound like a warning." "It doesn't," he said. She went to bed shortly after. He sat by the cooling fire with Thomas breathing slowly on the rug and the blue pitcher catching the last of the ember light and Eleanor's note in his pocket pressing its 9 words into his chest. He thought about a woman who checked exits, whose hands knew the hammer with the sureness of someone for whom utility had been necessary rather than chosen. Who had said people like that are often the loneliest people in the room in the voice of someone describing their own condition from the outside. He thought about Eleanor sitting across from him at this same table, hands folded, clear eyes, telling him something was real. He took the note out and held it. "Do not trust Hollis Brand. He knows what I found." He sat with those words and the fire and the dog and the dark Wyoming night for a long time. Then he went to bed. In the morning, Ruthie came through the door from the cold with her coat still on and her notebook open and her jaw in the set position. She sat across from him without removing her coat. She placed the notebook on the table between them and pointed to a page. She had drawn a horse in the margin, brown dark saddle band. Beside it she had written in her precise small hand Cord Lester. Arrived Dry Creek 3 weeks ago. Boarding house on Mill Street. Month paid in advance. No occupation given. No work taken. Below that, underlined twice arrived 3 weeks ago. Nora was still in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. He looked up from the notebook. Ruthie's face was steady. He was here before her, Garrett. He didn't follow her. He came ahead. She let that sit. Someone told him she was coming. Someone who knew her plans before she carried them out. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the frost lay heavy on the short grass, and the eastern trail was empty in the pale morning light, completely empty, not a horse or a rider anywhere on it, which was almost worse than if there had been. Garrett picked up the notebook. He read the entry again. He set it down. He thought about a woman testing the ground before she stepped off the stage, reading the street before she looked for the man who was supposed to be waiting, holding her cup too tight, saying, "My name is Nora Kane." That is what you need to know for now, in the voice of someone who had kept their real name close for a long time like a thing that could be taken. He thought about Eleanor's note. He stood up and took his coat from the hook. "Don't say anything to her yet," he said. "What are you going to do?" He buttoned his coat. He checked the note was in his pocket. 9 words, 5 years, and a woman in his house who had come here carrying something she had not yet named, who had been preceded by a stranger who had arrived 3 weeks early and asked for nothing and watched the road. "Find out what I should have found out 5 years ago," he said. He walked out into the cold morning. His boots came down on the frost, and the frost cracked cleanly under each step, and the sound of it was the sound of something being broken that had been frozen too long, and the eastern trail lay empty before him, and somewhere in the cabin behind him a woman was waking, who knew that she had been found, and had not yet decided whether the person who found her was someone she could afford to trust. He was going to give her a reason to decide in his favor. He owed Eleanor at least that much. The morning after Ruthie showed him the notebook entry, Garrett did not go to town. He had intended to. He had put on his coat and walked to the barn and saddled Senator and stood there with the reins in his hand for a full minute before he unsaddled him again and led him back to his stall and stood in the barn doorway looking at the cabin across the yard. The smoke from the chimney was moving straight up in the cold, still air. Through the kitchen window, he could see the shape of Nora moving the small domestic motions of someone making breakfast. She moved with the same economy she brought to everything. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He hung the saddle back on its bracket. He was not ready to go to town yet. He was not sure what he would do when he got there, or what he would ask, or who he could trust to answer honestly. Those were questions that needed more thought than he had given them in the cold, dark hours of the previous night, lying awake with the note in his hand and the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the cabin walls, and his own mind turning over the same ground without making progress. What he was ready to do was sit across from Nora Kane and place the notebook entry between them and wait. He went inside. She was at the stove. She heard him come in and turned briefly with the neutral expression she wore when she was not sure what to expect, which he had noticed was different from her ordinary neutral expression. Subtler. The eyes a degree more still. the hands continuing their work with the particular deliberateness of someone who is keeping them occupied on purpose. He went to the table. He picked up Ruthie's notebook from where he had left it and opened it to the page and set it in the center of the table. Then he sat down. He folded his hands. He waited. She brought 2 cups of coffee to the table. She set one in front of him. She looked at the notebook. She looked at it for long enough that he knew she understood what it meant, that the looking was not reading, but absorbing the way you absorb something that confirms a fear you have been carrying at a specific and careful distance. She sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke. Thomas came in from wherever he had been and settled on the rug with the sigh of a very old dog who has seen many mornings and found them mostly similar. Outside the window the frost was bright on the short grass, and the sky was doing something complicated with clouds that it had not resolved yet. 1 minute passed, perhaps a little more. Then Nora set down her cup. She placed both hands flat on the table palms down in the gesture of a person who is about to say something they have been rehearsing and have decided to say differently than they rehearsed. "My real name is Ivy Marsh," she said. He did not move. "I am 26 years old. I grew up in Illinois. I came to Wyoming 4 years ago to work as a bookkeeper and junior clerk for a trading company in Cheyenne." She paused. The company was owned by Hollis Brand. The kitchen was completely quiet. Garrett looked at her across the table. At the woman who had replaced the barn boards without being asked and made coffee before dawn, and held her cup too tight and told him her name in the voice of someone keeping something precious close. He looked at her and felt something tighten in his chest that was not anger and not fear, but something adjacent to both of them, something that lived between understanding and its consequences. He did not speak. He waited. He had learned in the long years of managing a working ranch and the shorter and more costly years of marriage that the most important thing a person could do when someone was finally ready to tell the truth was to be quiet enough for them to finish it. She told him slowly, not all at once, in the way that real things are told, with stops and reconsiderations and moments where she looked at her hands and moments where she looked at him as if checking to see whether the door was still open. Her name was Ivy Marsh. She had worked for Hollis Brand's trading company for 14 months, keeping the accounts, managing correspondence, doing the detailed and invisible work that keeps a business functioning and that people who run businesses prefer not to think too carefully about. She had been good at it. She had been grateful for the work. She had not asked questions about the parts of the ledger that seemed irregular, because she had learned early that the people who asked those questions did not keep their positions long. Then 8 months ago she had made an error. Not in the accounts. The accounts she kept perfectly. The error was simpler and more consequential. She had arrived at the office earlier than anyone expected on a Tuesday morning in February, when the streets were still dark, and the cold was the particular ferocious cold of a Wyoming February that convinces you winter is a permanent condition. She had let herself in with her key. She had gone to her desk, and she had heard voices from the back office that she was not meant to hear. Hollis Brand's voice, and another man's voice she did not recognize at the time. She had not moved. She had sat at her desk in her coat with her hands in her lap and listened to 14 minutes of conversation that described in the practical and undecorated language of men discussing business, a network that moved women across 3 states. Women who had answered advertisements for domestic positions, for teaching posts, for mail-order arrangements with ranchers and farmers and men of property. Women who arrived and were placed, and whose husbands in time received visits from representatives of Hollis Brand's various interests, presenting evidence of irregularities of debts of past histories that the husbands had not known about, some real and many constructed. And the husbands paid. They paid quietly because the alternative was a scandal, and because the men who came to collect were the kind of men who did not need to raise their voices to make themselves understood. She had sat at her desk for 14 minutes. Then she had heard the back office door move. She had taken 3 items from her desk drawer. A small ledger she had been maintaining privately for 6 months, in which she had recorded the irregularities she had not asked questions about. A folded document she had copied by hand from a file she had been asked to organize and return, and a list of names she had assembled from the correspondence that passed through her hands, names of men in positions of authority whose signatures appeared in places they should not have appeared and whose payments arrived in amounts that had no legitimate explanation. She had put these 3 items in her coat pocket and walked out of the office and not gone back. She had been moving since February. 8 months. 3 cities. 2 names she had used and discarded. Nora Kane had been her 3rd. The real Nora Kane was a woman she had met in a boarding house in Laramie, a woman who had been corresponding with a rancher in Montana and who had received the week Ivy arrived a letter from her intended informing her politely that he had changed his circumstances and would not require a bride. The real Nora Kane had been 24 years old and furious and planning to go to California, and had been willing for the sum of $30 to allow Ivy to use her name and her advertisement history to establish a correspondence with a rancher in a different county who would not know the difference. Garrett sat with all of this. He turned his cup on the table once, then again. He looked at the window. He looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "The documents you took, the ledger, and the list, do you have them with you?" "Yes." "Where?" She reached into the inner pocket of the coat that was always on the hook by her room door, always within reach, and placed on the table between them a small oilskin packet tied with a cord. She did not untie it. He did not ask her to. "There are names in there," she said quietly, "of men in this county, men with authority, men that people here trust." She paused. "I don't know yet who in Dry Creek is connected to Brand and who is not. That is why I have not gone to the sheriff." He looked at the packet. He looked at her. And then he said something he had not planned to say, something that came from a place that was not strategy or calculation, but something older and more direct. He said, 8 months ago you took those documents, and you have been carrying them alone since then." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "and you chose this place, this ranch, this arrangement." "I needed somewhere to stop moving." Her voice was steady. Her hands were not quite. "I needed somewhere that felt like it might hold." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed one of the 2 cups toward her, the one that had gone slightly cool, and said, "Then stop moving." She looked at the cup. She looked at him. Something in her face moved in a way that he had not seen before. Something that was not the almost smile, and not the carefully maintained neutral, and not the watchfulness. Something that was simpler and more unguarded than any of those things. Something that looked for just a moment like relief so profound it bordered on pain. She picked up the cup. They sat at the table for another hour. He asked questions and she answered them, and he listened without interrupting, and without the expressions that people sometimes wore when they were hearing difficult things, the expressions of judgment or discomfort or the particular performance of sympathy that was mostly about the person performing it. He listened the way he listened to the ranch, with his whole attention and without needing it to be different from what it was. He did not tell her about Eleanor's note. Not yet. He was not sure why. Some instinct that the time was not right, that there was an order to these things, and he had not yet reached the moment when that piece belonged in the sequence. When Ruthie came in from the cold at mid-morning, she looked at the 2 of them at the table and at the oilskin packet, and at the particular quality of the air in the room which had changed. She sat down without being invited, and looked at Ivy, whose name she did not yet know was Ivy. "Your name isn't Nora Kane," Ruthie said. It was not a question. Ivy looked at her. "No." Ruthie opened her notebook. "What is it?" "Ivy Marsh." Ruthie wrote it down. She looked up. "All right," she said. "Tell me what I need to know." Ivy told her. Shorter this time, the compressed version that carried the essential facts without the stops and reconsiderations. Ruthie listened with her pencil moving in small notations, and her face doing the thing it did when it was working still and intent and not giving anything away. When Ivy finished, Ruthie tapped her pencil on the notebook. "Cord Lester," she said. Ivy went still. "Brown horse, dark saddle band. He arrived in Dry Creek 3 weeks before you did. He's been watching the road from the eastern trail." Ruthie's voice was level. "He's here because someone told Brand where you were going. Someone who knew before you left." Ivy set her cup down carefully. Her face had returned to the managed expression the door mostly closed, but her eyes had changed. Something moving in them that was old and exhausted. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been running long enough to forget that they were ever still. "I didn't tell anyone," she said. "I wrote the advertisement response from a telegraph office in Laramie. I used Nora Kane's name. I paid cash. I didn't tell a living soul." "Someone knew anyway," Ruthie said. The three of them sat with that. Ivy was quiet for a long moment. Then something moved in her face. Not surprise. The slow recognition of a person assembling pieces they already held. "The real Nora Kane," she said. Garrett looked at her. "I paid her $30 in Laramie. She was angry about her own situation. She didn't know who Brand was or what he did." Ivy set her cup down. "But she knew my direction. She knew the county. She may have mentioned it to someone or written to someone without understanding what it meant." She paused. "I chose her because she had no connection to Brand. I didn't consider that she had no reason to protect me either." Ruthie wrote something in her notebook. "So Brand didn't track you. He was handed a direction by someone who didn't know they were handing it." "Yes," Ivy said. "That's worse in a way. It means I can't trace the leak. It was accidental. Accidents don't leave trails." Outside, the clouds had made their decision, and the sky had settled into the flat gray that it would maintain for the rest of the day. The frost on the grass had melted. The eastern trail was empty and had been empty all morning, which meant nothing because empty and unoccupied were different things, and Garrett had spent enough time on open land to know the difference. He stood up. He put on his coat. He looked at Ivy. "Stay inside today," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "I've been told that before, by people who meant it as a cage." "I mean it as a door with a lock," he said. "There's a difference." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded. He went to town. Walt Greer was leaning against the post outside the sheriff's office when Garrett arrived, as he was most mornings, with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who was perpetually slightly behind on his sleep. He was 55 years old, deputy sheriff of Dry Creek for 11 years, built like a man who had once been larger and had diminished slightly without losing the essential structure. He had a face like weathered saddle leather and pale blue eyes that tended to slide to the side of whatever they were aimed at, which Garrett had always attributed to habit and was now reconsidering. They talked about nothing for a few minutes. The weather, the Tilbert property, whether the early cold meant a hard winter or just an impatient autumn. Then Garrett said, "Tell me what you know about Cord Lester." Walt's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. A small motion, barely perceptible. The kind of arrest that a person makes when a name lands in a place they were not expecting it. "Drifter," Walt said. "Staying over at the Mill Street boarding house. Hasn't caused trouble." "Do you know why he's here?" "Men pass through." "He's been here 3 weeks. He paid a month in advance. He doesn't work." Garrett kept his voice even. "That's not passing through. That's waiting." Walt looked at his coffee. He looked at the street. He looked at a point approximately 8 inches to the left of Garrett's face. "Garrett," he said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. Some quality of ease that had been there a moment ago. "There are things in this town that are better left to sort themselves out." "Eleanor thought so too," Garrett said. "That worked out poorly." Walt's jaw tightened. Garrett waited. He had learned patience at the fence line and the cattle and the long years of managing a ranch that demanded more than it gave on most days. He was patient now. He stood in the cold street and waited and watched Walt Greer's profile and the way the man's hands had gone rigid around his cup. Then Walt said very quietly, "Come inside." The sheriff's office was empty. The sheriff himself, a man named Aldous Crane, who had held the position for 12 years, was reportedly in Laramie on county business. Walt closed the door and did not light a second lamp, and stood in the gray window light with his coffee cup held in both hands like something he needed to hold on to. He did not look at Garrett directly. He spoke to the floor mostly, to his boots, to the middle distance. He said, 10 years ago I took money. Once. From a man who said it was for overlooking a small irregularity in some cargo documentation. I told myself it was minor, that it hurt nobody, that it was the only time. He paused. It was the only time I took money. It was not the only time I looked the other way. Garrett said nothing. Hollis Brand has known about that payment for 10 years. He reminded me of it from time to time, never aggressively, just to establish that he knew. Walt's voice was flat, the voice of a man describing something he has described to himself many times in private. I told myself I was protecting my family, my position. I told myself the things a man tells himself when he has made a choice he cannot unmake and needs to keep living with it. He finally looked up. "Eleanor came to me," he said, "about 14 months before she died. She had found something in Brand's accounts. She asked me if I could help her get it to someone who could act on it, someone above Brand's reach." He stopped. His eyes were the flat, pale blue of a man looking at something he had been not looking at for a very long time. "I told her I couldn't help her. I told her to let it go. I told her she was getting into something that would hurt her and her family." He looked at Garrett. 2 weeks later she was dead. The room was very quiet. Garrett stood with his hands at his sides and the note in his shirt pocket and the words, "Do not trust Hollis Brand," pressing their 9 small shapes into his chest, and he breathed slowly and carefully, and did not allow what was moving through him to reach his face, because what was moving through him was large and many-directioned, and this was not the moment for it. "You knew," Garrett said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact delivered in the level voice of a man who needs to know the dimensions of a thing before he can decide what to do with it. "I suspected," Walt said. "I didn't know. I told myself I didn't know." He set his cup down on the nearest surface. His hands were unsteady. "I have told myself that for 5 years, Garrett, and there is not a morning I have woken up and believed it." Garrett stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "The woman at my ranch. Are you going to tell Brand she's there?" Walt looked at him. "I haven't yet." "Are you going to—" A long pause, the gray light through the window, the cold town outside doing its cold morning business. "No," Walt said. "I am not." Garrett nodded once. He picked up his hat from the desk where he had set it. "Then I need you to do something," he said, "and I need you to do it without telling anyone, including Crane." Walt looked at him with the eyes of a man who has been waiting without knowing. He was waiting for someone to ask him for something he could actually do. "Tell me," Walt said. He told Ivy that evening. Not all of it at once. He told her in the order that he had understood it himself, which was the honest order, the one that showed where the gaps had been and how long they had been gaps. He told her about Eleanor's note. He put it on the table between them and watched her read it, and watched her face do what faces do when they are given confirmation of something they had feared was true. She touched the edge of the paper without picking it up. "She knew," Ivy said. "She was trying to find out more. She came to me 3 days before she died and told me she thought Brand was doing something wrong." He paused. "I told her she worried too much." Ivy looked up. "I've been carrying that for 5 years," he said. "I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you so you understand the shape of what we're dealing with. Eleanor knew. She tried to act on it. She died before she could." He looked at the note. "You know, you've been carrying what she was trying to find." The fire in the stove worked through its wood with small, patient sounds. Thomas was in his usual position on the rug, his gray muzzle on his paws, his breathing the slow rhythm of very old sleep. Ivy was quiet for a long time. Then she untied the oilskin packet. She laid the contents on the table in the order she had assembled them. The private ledger she had kept a small book with a brown cover, pages dense with her careful handwriting. The copied document 2 pages folded together, the hand copying of it so precise that it looked almost printed, and the list of names a single folded sheet written in a smaller hand than the ledger. She opened the ledger to a page she knew without searching for it. She placed her finger on a line. He looked at it. His eyes moved over the entry. Date amount notation. He read it once and then read it again because the first reading did not seem possible and the second reading confirmed that it was. The entry was dated 18 months ago. The amount was substantial. The notation read, Northern Trail Access Quarterly Maintenance EF, Eleanor Finch. He looked at Ivy. "That is not what it looks like," she said. Her voice was careful and direct. She had thought about how to say this. Brand's notations are deliberately misleading. He records payments made to people as though they are payments made by those people. It protects him. If the ledger is ever found, it appears that the named parties are participants rather than targets. She turned the ledger to face him more directly. This notation means Brand paid someone for access to the Northern Trail during the period when your wife was using it regularly. It is not a record of anything Eleanor did. It is a record of what was done to her. He sat with that. The Northern Trail, where Eleanor's horse had thrown her, where she had struck her head on a rock, where the animal had been found calm and showing no sign of the panic it was said to have experienced. He sat with it for a long time. Ruthie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had been in her room since supper, which in retrospect had probably not been accidental. She came in and sat down and looked at the ledger and looked at Garrett and said nothing because she understood, as she generally did when words were the wrong instrument. He put his hand flat on the table beside the ledger. He looked at Eleanor's note and the ledger entry and the oilskin packet that had traveled through 3 states in the coat pocket of a woman he had known for less than a week and who had been carrying it alone for 8 months and who had looked at a street before she looked at his face and who had said, "I need somewhere that might hold." He said, "Who else is on the list?" Ivy unfolded the single sheet. She had written the names in a column, last name first, with a notation beside each one indicating the nature of their connection to Brand's operation. There were 11 names. He read down the column slowly. On the 4th line he stopped. Walt Greer, Deputy Sheriff, Dry Creek, 1 payment 9 years prior. Notation retained. He had known this was possible. Walt had told him as much that morning. Seeing it written was different from hearing it. Seeing it written made it a fact with a fixed location in the world rather than a thing that existed only in the uncertain space of a man's confession. He moved down the list. On the 8th line he stopped again. He read the name 3 times. Judge Orrin Pell, Magistrate, Dry Creek County, ongoing payments notation, judicial access. He looked up. Ivy was watching him. She had been watching him read the list the way you watch a person open a door that you know leads somewhere difficult, present and attentive, and not able to do anything except be there when they come through it. "The county judge," he said. "Yes." "Orrin Pell." "Yes." He thought about Judge Pell. 60 years old, white-haired with the deliberate courtroom manner of a man who understood that authority was mostly about patience and volume, and the willingness to let a silence do the work that words would do less well. He had presided over every significant legal matter in Dry Creek County for 15 years. He had spoken at Eleanor's memorial. He had said that Eleanor Finch had been a woman of uncommon grace and that the community was diminished by her absence. Garrett placed the list back on the table. He breathed in, he breathed out. Ruthie was watching him with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation for signs of a particular development. He knew the development she was watching for. He had felt it building since that morning in Walt's office, since the moment Walt said 2 weeks later she was dead. He had felt it building since 5 years ago, if he was being honest, since the moment he said, "Eleanor, you worry too much," and went back to his numbers. He did not give it to her. He put it somewhere it could be dealt with later after the necessary work was done. He had learned in the long managing years that feelings were not enemies of action. They were fuel. The difference between a man who acted from fury and a man who acted from purpose was whether the fury was in charge or the man was. He was in charge. He looked at Ivy. "Walt is not our enemy," he said. "He told me today that he has been looking the other way for 10 years and that he wants to stop." He paused. "I believe him." "Because he told you so." "Because of the way he stood when he told me. There are men who confess to unburden themselves. He wasn't unburdening. He was taking the weight back on." Ivy considered this. She had the quality he had noticed of actually considering things she was told rather than simply deciding. She turned the information in her hands, looked at its angles, weighed it. "All right," she said. "Then Walt is an asset. If he holds." People who have been afraid for a long time sometimes find that they can't stop being afraid even when they want to. "I know." He looked at her. "You've been afraid for 8 months." She met his eyes. "Yes." "You're still here." A pause. Something shifting in her expression, the particular movement of a person updating something they had believed about themselves. "Yes," she said again differently. Ruthie leaned forward. She had been quiet long enough. "Bran doesn't know she's here yet, or he didn't when Cord Lester arrived, but Lester has been watching the road. If he's reported back, Bran knows now." She tapped her notebook. "We have time or we don't. We need to find out which." "I'll talk to Lester," Garrett said. Both women looked at him. "Not confrontationally," he said. "Just a conversation. I want to understand what he knows and what he's been told, and whether he's the kind of man who's in this because he wants to be or because he doesn't know how to get out." "You think there's a difference," Ivy said. "I think there's often a difference. Bran doesn't keep loyal men. He keeps men. He has something on men who owe him, men who have made one wrong choice and been owned by it since. Walt Greer is that kind of man. There may be others." He stood up. "Loyal men fight to the end. Owned men look for a way to put their debt down." He took Eleanor's note from the table. He folded it back along its lines. He placed it in his pocket. Ivy was watching him with the expression he had seen on the stage platform in the moment after she had checked the street and found him. The moment of assessment. The moment of deciding. She said, "Why are you doing this? She was your wife and Brand may have had her killed, so I understand that part. But you didn't know any of this when I arrived. You just knew a woman was coming. You could have turned me away. You could have handed me over when Ruthie found Lester's name. You could have decided this wasn't yours to carry." He thought about the answer honestly. "Eleanor knew something was wrong," he said. "She tried to do something about it alone because she didn't think I was ready to help her. She was right. I wasn't ready." He looked at the oilskin packet on the table, the ledger, the list, the 8 months of a woman moving through 3 states alone. "I'm ready now. I'm just late." Outside, the night had fully arrived, complete and very dark, and the Wyoming stars were doing their winter work of making the sky look infinite and merciless and beautiful. May Sutton knocked on the door at 8:30. Garrett opened it to find her standing in the cold with her coat buttoned to the throat and an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not alarmed. Not exactly. Something more resolved than alarmed. The expression of a person who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally decided. She came inside. She looked at Ivy. She looked at the ledger and the list on the table with the particular recognition of someone who had been expecting to see something like this for a while. She sat down without being invited. She folded her hands on the table. "I should have come sooner," May said. "I knew something about Eleanor that I kept because I thought keeping it was protecting you." She looked at Garrett steadily. "I was wrong. I kept it because I was afraid, and I dressed the fear up as consideration for your feelings. And that was a lie I told myself, and I am done telling it." She reached into her coat. She placed an envelope on the table. Old, the paper gone slightly yellow at the edges, the seal long since pressed flat. On the front, in Eleanor's handwriting, 5 words, "For whoever needs it most." "She brought it to me 3 days before she died," May said. "She said she was going to meet with someone who might be able to help her. She said if she didn't come back, I should give it to the person who came along later asking the same questions she had been asking." She looked at the envelope. "She didn't come back." She looked at Ivy. "I think that's you," May said. Ivy looked at the envelope. She looked at Garrett. He nodded. She picked it up. She opened it carefully, the way you open something you understand has been waiting for the right moment for a long time. Inside were 2 folded pages. She unfolded them and read in silence. Her face was still. Her breathing was careful. When she reached the bottom of the second page, she stopped and looked up, and her eyes were very bright. "She made her own copy," Ivy said. Her voice was low. "She had a contact in Denver, a federal judge. She wrote his name and address here. She was going to send this to him." She turned the page over. "She wrote it all out. Everything she found. More than I have. There are dates here I don't have. Transactions I never saw." She placed the pages on the table. "Eleanor Finch was 3 days from blowing this entire operation apart," she said. The room was completely silent. Garrett looked at the pages in Eleanor's careful handwriting, the same hand that had written 9 words on a small folded piece of paper that had been in his shirt pocket for 5 years. He looked at them for a long time. Ruthie said softly, "She was right. She was always right," he said. He picked up the pages. He held them and looked at them, and somewhere in the room a fire burned steadily, and an old dog breathed in his sleep, and a woman who had been running for 8 months sat across the table with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes clear, and a 68-year-old woman who had kept a secret for 5 years and would not keep it anymore sat beside her. He put the pages back in the envelope. He placed it on top of the oilskin packet. He said, "We are going to finish what Eleanor started." No one disagreed. Outside, the night held its cold, and the eastern trail was dark, and somewhere in Dry Creek, a man named Cord Lester was in a boarding house on Mill Street, and a judge named Orrin Pell was in his house with his payments and his position and his 15 years of looking legitimate, and Hollis Brand was wherever Hollis Brand was, in his trading office or his fine house or the comfortable darkness of a man who has not yet been found out and does not believe he will be. They did not know yet what was coming. Garrett Finch knew. He had known since the moment May placed the envelope on the table, and he had seen Eleanor's handwriting on the front of it. He had known since Ivy said she was 3 days from blowing this entire operation apart. Eleanor had been 3 days away. She had not gotten there. He was going to get there. He owed her that. He owed her considerably more than that, but this was what he had to work with, and he intended to make it enough. The morning Hollis Brand came to the double ridge, the sky was the color of old bone, and the wind had stopped entirely, which in Wyoming in late autumn meant the weather was gathering itself for something considerable. Garrett noticed the stillness when he stepped outside at first light. He stood on the porch and looked at the horizon in all 4 directions and noted that the cottonwoods along the creek were completely motionless, not a leaf moving, the world holding its breath. He went back inside and put more wood on the fire. The knock came at 2 in the afternoon. Garrett was at the table going over the contents of Eleanor's envelope for the 4th time, reading her careful notations in the margins, following the logic of what she had assembled, with the focus of a man who understands he is reading the work of someone considerably more meticulous than himself. Ivy was at the dry sink with her back to the room, her hands occupied with something that did not require occupation, which he had come to recognize as the posture she adopted when she was thinking hard about something she had not resolved. Ruthie was not in the cabin. She had gone to town that morning on the errand they had agreed on, the one that needed doing before anything else could move forward, and she had not yet returned. The knock was confident, not loud, the knock of a man who did not need volume because he had never found it necessary to raise his voice to achieve his purposes. Garrett looked at Ivy. She had gone still at the sound. Her hands had stopped their motion. Her shoulders had taken on the particular set he associated with the watchfulness she carried like a second skin, the posture of someone who has heard a sound they recognize and does not yet know whether it is the thing they feared or something adjacent to it. He crossed to the door and opened it. Hollis Brand stood on the porch in a coat that had cost more than most men in Dry Creek earned in 2 months, holding his hat in both hands with the practiced gesture of a man visiting a neighbor. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered and well-kept, with gray at his temples, and a face that had arranged itself over the years into an expression of permanent and apparently sincere reasonableness. He looked like a man you could trust. He looked like a man who understood that looking trustworthy was an investment that paid reliable dividends. Beside him, standing slightly back and to the left with the posture of a man who has been told to look non-threatening, was someone Garrett did not recognize, Younger, thinner, with the still quality of a man who was accustomed to waiting. Brand smiled. "Garrett," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're here," Garrett said. "Come in if you want." It was the wrong invitation, and he knew it as he said it. But letting Brand stand on the porch was not better. At least inside Brand was contained. Outside Brand was adjacent to the barn and the horses and the eastern trail and all the open ground between the double ridge and whatever came next. Brand stepped inside. His companion remained on the porch. Brand looked around the cabin with the comfortable manner of a man who was accustomed to assessing things without appearing to do so. His eyes found Ivy. She had turned from the dry sink. She was standing with her hands at her sides and her face in the careful neutral, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was very still inside and very alert. Brand looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. "I heard you had company," he said pleasantly. "Dry Creek is a small town. Word travels." "It does," Garrett said. Brand moved to the table with the easy permission of a man who did not wait for invitations. He pulled out a chair and sat down with the deliberate comfort of a man establishing that he was not in a hurry and was not concerned and wanted you to know both of those things. He set his hat on this table and folded his hands over it and looked at Garrett with an expression of earnest and personal regard. "I want you to know," Brand said, "that I think of you as a friend. I have always thought of you that way. Since long before Eleanor passed. Your family has been part of this community for 2 generations, and that means something to me." He paused. "It means enough that I came here personally rather than sending someone." Garrett sat down across from him. He did not say anything. Brand glanced at Ivy, then back at Garrett. "I wonder if we might speak privately. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of her." Brand held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly with the expression of a man making a reasonable accommodation. "All right," he said. He looked at Ivy directly for the first time since sitting down, not aggressively, not with threat, with the calm and impersonal regard of a businessman looking at a problem he has looked at before and knows how to manage. "I want you to know, Ivy, that I don't bear you any ill will. What you took from my office caused me difficulty. It caused me more than difficulty. But I understand that you were frightened, and that frightened people make decisions that they might make differently given more time and more information." Ivy said nothing. Her face gave nothing. "I would like the documents returned," Brand said. "The ledger, the copied pages, and the list. In exchange, I am prepared to let this matter rest entirely. No pursuit, no legal action, no difficulty for anyone in this room." He opened his hands in a gesture of simple generosity. "You could stay here, build a life. I would have no further interest in anything you do." The fire in the stove was the only sound in the room for a moment. Then Brand looked at Garrett. "You are a good man," Brand said. "You have always been a good man. Eleanor was a good woman. I grieved her loss genuinely. I want you to believe that." His voice was measured and even and entirely convincing in the way that things are convincing when the person saying them has had sufficient practice. "What I am offering you is a way to keep what you have built here. The ranch, your sister's future, the possibility of something new." His eyes moved briefly to Ivy. "None of that needs to be sacrificed." Garrett looked at him. He looked at this man who had come to his table with his hat in his hands and his reasonable voice and his offer of peace, and he thought about Eleanor sitting across a different table with her hands folded, telling him something was real. He thought about Walt Greer speaking to the floor of his own office. He thought about 14 months of a woman moving through 3 states alone with an oilskin packet in her coat pocket. He thought about an envelope that had sat in May Sutton's possession for 5 years with 5 words on the front of it. He thought about a notation in a ledger. Northern Trail Access, Quarterly Maintenance, EF. He said, "Eleanor came to you." Brand was still. "Before she died," Garrett said, "she had found something. She tried to do something about it. I think she may have come to you directly or tried to. I think she believed the way people believe that you were a reasonable man who might be reasoned with." He kept his voice level. "I think she was wrong about that." Brand's expression did not change. That was the thing about him that was most dangerous, Garrett thought. The expressions never changed at the wrong moment. He had the face of a man who had trained himself to feel things only when it was useful to be seen feeling them. "Eleanor's death was a tragedy," Brand said. "Yes," Garrett said. "It was." A silence. Brand looked at him for a long time. Then he did something Garrett had not expected. He looked briefly and entirely tired. Not guilty, not afraid, just tired in the way of a man who has been managing many things for many years and finds that the managing has become its own kind of weight. "You're not going to take the offer," Brand said. "No." Brand nodded once. He picked up his hat. He stood with the unhurried movement of a man who had arrived with a purpose and was departing with a revised purpose which was not the same as departing defeated. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame in the exact position May Sutton had stood in on a Monday morning that felt like a long time ago. He looked back at Garrett. "I have been doing what I do for 20 years, he said. "In that time I have dealt with sheriffs and judges and senators and men who believed they had found a way to stop me. I want you to understand something clearly, not as a threat, as a fact." His voice was the same as it had been throughout, measured and even and entirely without heat. "The documents she is carrying are not the only copies of the problem. I am not the only interested party. There are men whose names are on that list who have considerably more to lose than I do and considerably more resources to protect their interests." He put on his hat. "I'll see you again soon, Garrett," he said. He walked out. His companion fell into step beside him. Garrett stood in the doorway and watched them cross the yard and mount their horses and ride down the south road at an unhurried pace, not looking back. He closed the door. Ivy was standing in the center of the room. She was looking at the space where Brand had sat with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not fear. Something past fear. The particular expression of a person who has been running from something for a long time and has finally turned around to look at it directly and found that it is exactly as large as they always knew it was. "He'll come back tonight," she said. "Yes." "With more people?" "Yes." She looked at him. "He means what he said about the other men, the ones on the list. Brand is the visible part. The men he works for, the men he works with, they have more reach than he does. If this goes wrong tonight, it doesn't end here." "I know." She crossed the room. She stood in front of him with her hands at her sides and her face very clear and very steady. "I want to do something," she said. "Not hide, not wait. Something." He looked at her. He thought about what Ruthie had gone to town to do that morning. He thought about Walt Greer standing in his gray office with his coffee cup and his confession and his 10 years of looking sideways. He thought about Eleanor's envelope and the name and address of a federal judge in Denver written in Eleanor's careful hand. "Ruthie went to the telegraph office this morning," he said. Ivy waited. "She sent a wire to Denver, to the address in Eleanor's envelope." He moved to the fireplace. On the mantel beside the blue pitcher he had placed a folded piece of paper that morning. He picked it up. "The reply came 2 hours ago." He handed it to her. She unfolded it. She read it. Her eyes moved across the words twice. "Federal Judge Arthur Kane, Denver District. Reply received. Dispatching immediately. Arrive Dry Creek approximately 36 hours. Hold position." She looked up. "Kane," she said. "My assumed name." Eleanor chose her contact well. His name meant something, apparently. Ruthie used it in the wire, said she was acting on behalf of a woman named Nora Kane who had information pertaining to an ongoing federal matter. He responded within the hour. He took the wire back. 36 hours. We need to get through tonight." She handed him the telegram. Her hand was steady. "Then we get through tonight," she said. What followed was the work of preparation, which in Garrett's experience was both the most practical and the most frightening part of any difficult undertaking. Practical because it gave your hands something to do. Frightening because each thing you prepared for was a thing you were admitting might happen. He spent the remaining daylight hours moving through the cabin and barn with the systematic attention of a man who knew this ground better than any other ground in the world and intended to use that knowledge. He checked the lamp placements. He moved certain items from certain locations. He walked the perimeter of the ranch yard and noted where the darkness would be deepest when the moon went behind the clouds, which it would, because the sky said so. Ivy worked beside him without being asked what to do or where to go. She had the quality in these hours of someone who had stopped performing anything and was simply being what they were, which turned out to be capable and clear-headed and entirely without the kind of fearfulness that makes people slow. She was afraid. He could see that. She carried it the way she carried everything acknowledged and managed and not in charge of her. At dusk, Ruthie returned from her second trip to town. She came in with her notebook and her coat and the look she wore when she had information. She sat down and told them. Cord Lester had been in the livery stable when she arrived. She had walked in directly and stood in front of him and said without preamble, "I know why you're here and I know who sent you. I also know that you warned me 2 weeks ago to leave town, and I want to know why you did that." She reported that Cord Lester had looked at her for a long moment, that he was younger than she had expected, not yet 30, with the face of a man who had made a decision he was not certain about and had been living with the uncertainty since. He had said, "Brand told me to watch the road and report who came and went. He didn't tell me why. When I figured out why, I didn't want any part of it." Ruthie had asked him what Brand had told him about tonight. He had said, 7 men. Coming from the North Road after dark. Brand wants the documents and the woman. He wants it done before the town wakes up. Ruthie had asked him whose side he was on. He had said, "I owe Brand money. I owe him a lot of money, but I don't owe him this." She had told him what to do. Garrett looked at his sister. She looked back at him with the expression she had worn since the age of 8 when she had decided something was right and was waiting for him to confirm it. "You told him to go to Walt," Garrett said. "I told him to go to Walt and tell him everything and then do what Walt said." She opened her notebook. "Walt has 2 men he trusts, not Brand's men. His own from before Brand had enough reach to place people. They will be on the North Road." He looked at her for a long moment. 22 years old, a notebook and a pencil, and the absolute refusal to be surprised by the world again. "Ruthie," he said. "Don't," she said. "We don't have time." May arrived at 7. She came without being summoned, which meant she had heard something in town, which meant the town knew something was in the air, the way small towns always knew through the accumulation of small observations made by people who did not know they were making them. She came with a covered pot because she was May, and that was how she moved through the world, and she was not going to change it tonight. She set the pot on the stove. She looked around the room. She said, "Tell me what you need." They ate, all 4 of them at the table in the last of the lamplight before Garrett turned it low. May's food was what it always was, which was the kind of food that reminded you that the ordinary things were worth protecting. Nobody said this. Everybody knew it. After supper, May cleared the dishes with the same movement she always used, and then sat back down and folded her hands and looked at Ivy. "I want to tell you something," May said. "About Eleanor." Ivy looked at her. "She was not reckless," May said. "People who do what she did, who go looking at things other people prefer not to look at, they get called reckless. Troublemakers. People who should have left well enough alone." She shook her head. Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew the risk, and she chose to do it anyway, not because she was careless with herself, because she believed the risk was worth taking. She looked at Ivy steadily. "You are the same kind of person. I recognized it the moment I saw you." She paused. "I want you to know that, because the kind of courage you're carrying doesn't get named very often." Ivy looked at May for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you." It was the first time Garrett had heard those 2 words from her carry that particular weight. Not courtesy. Receiving. The night came fully down. The stars appeared briefly, and then the clouds moved across them, and the darkness became the complete darkness of open country, with no moon, which was what Garrett had expected and prepared for. They waited. They came at 10:30. Garrett heard them first. Not the hoofbeats which the soft ground muffled, but the particular silence that preceded them, the way the small night sounds of the ranch, the insects, the settling of the barn, the distant creek all ceased at once as if the land itself was holding its breath again. He said quietly, "They're on the north road." He moved to his position at the window without hurrying. Ivy went to the door of the side room as they had arranged. May was at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. Ruthie was in the barn, which she had insisted on, and which Garrett had argued against for 4 minutes before recognizing that his sister was going to be in the barn, regardless of his position on the matter. 7 horses. He counted them in the first thin light of a lantern that one of the riders carried, which was a mistake on their part. A lantern told you how many were coming and where. He watched them come down the north approach in a loose formation, unhurried the movement of men who expected their arrival to be the conclusion of the matter rather than its complication. Brand was not among them. This was information. Brand had sent his men and remained wherever Brand remained when things were being done on his behalf. That was how Brand had operated for 20 years, which was why he had operated for 20 years without consequences. He was never present. He was always responsible. The distance between those two facts was where he lived. The lead rider called out from the yard, "Finch, send the woman out with the documents and we leave peaceful." Garrett did not answer from the window. He had already moved. What happened in the next 12 minutes was not the kind of event that arranged itself into a clean sequence afterward. It was the kind of event that existed in fragments, each one vivid and specific, the way significant things are remembered. The lantern going out when Ruthie did what she had gone to the barn to do, cutting the yard into absolute darkness and costing the riders the one navigational tool they had trusted. The sound of Walt Greer's voice from the north road, flat and authoritative, identifying himself and instructing the riders to dismount, and the moment of hesitation in the yard that preceded everything else. 2 riders breaking left toward the barn, which was what Garrett had expected, and moved to intercept. The third man reaching the porch steps and finding that the door he pushed open had been rigged to give way in a manner that sent him into the room at an angle that was not the angle he had prepared for. It was physical, and it was loud, and it was frightening in the way that real danger is frightening, which is different from the way imagined danger is frightening. Imagined danger is large and shapeless. Real danger is specific and immediate and demands everything you have right now. Garrett had everything he had. He used it. When it was over, which took longer than 12 minutes to become clear, but not much longer, 5 of the 7 riders were disarmed and on the ground in the yard. Walt Greer and his 2 men had taken the 2 who broke for the north road before they reached it. Cord Lester had done what Ruthie asked him to do, which was to be at the south end of the property before dark and make sure that nobody left that way. Nobody had. Ruthie came out of the barn with a lantern and a look on her face that Garrett recognized from childhood, the look she wore when something she had prepared for had occurred exactly as prepared for. She was not pleased exactly. Satisfied was closer. The satisfaction of someone who had decided the world was not going to surprise her again and had on this particular night been correct. Ivy stepped out of the side room and onto the porch. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the yard, at the men on the ground, at Walt Greer standing on the periphery with the expression of a man who has just done the first unambiguously right thing he has done in 10 years and is not yet sure what to do with the feeling. She looked at Garrett. He had a cut on his left hand from something he had not had time to identify, and his coat was missing a button, and he was in the particular way of a man who had just defended something he valued completely and entirely present in a way he had not been for 5 years. She came down the steps and crossed the yard to him. She said, "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at his left hand. "That is a lie," she said. "It's a minor truth," he said. She almost smiled. Then she did smile completely, and it was the same as the first time he had seen it, brief and real and altering everything. May appeared in the cabin doorway with clean cloth and the practical demeanor of a woman who had anticipated this requirement. She gestured at Garrett with the cloth and the authority of 68 years of dealing with men who described injuries as minor. He went inside. The night was not finished yet. The night was in certain important respects only beginning. Walt secured the 5 men from the yard to the fence posts with rope and the assistance of Cord Lester, who worked with the focused efficiency of a man paying a debt he was glad to be paying. When it was done, Walt stood in the yard and looked at the situation he had created, and then looked at Garrett and said, "Brand will know by morning." "Yes," Garrett said. "He'll go to Pell. He'll use whatever legal mechanism Pell has available to him. He'll try to get ahead of this." "I know. The federal judge is 36 hours away." Walt did his arithmetic plainly in the manner of a man who had spent 10 years not doing arithmetic he should have done and was not going to make that error again. That's enough time for Brand and Pell together to create considerable difficulty for the woman if they move fast. Ivy had come to stand beside Garrett. She said, "What kind of difficulty?" "An arrest warrant," Walt said. "Theft, fraud, using a false identity. All things that are technically true and none of which tell the whole story. If Pell signs a warrant for your arrest and I am obligated to execute it, then anything you are holding becomes evidence in a criminal proceeding that Pell controls." He looked at her directly. "The documents would be confiscated by the court, by Pell." The yard was quiet. The 5 men at the fence posts were not causing trouble. Overhead, the clouds had begun to break and the first stars were reappearing. Ivy said, "Then we need to make sure that when the warrant comes, if it comes, what I'm holding is already somewhere Pell cannot reach it." She looked at Garrett. He thought about Ruthie at the telegraph office. He thought about the reply that had come within an hour. He thought about Eleanor's careful handwriting on the envelope and the name she had chosen 5 years ago with the instinct of a woman who paid attention to the right things. He went inside. He came back out with the oilskin packet and Eleanor's envelope and the telegram from Denver. He handed all of it to Walt. Walt looked at him. "Not to Pell," Garrett said. "Not to Crane. Not to anyone in this county." "I know. Can you get it to the Denver road before morning? Someone you trust to ride through the night." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cord." They both looked at Cord Lester, who was tying a final knot on the fence post with the careful attention of a young man concentrating on something he could control. Walt said, "Lester." Cord turned. "Can you ride to Denver?" Walt said. Cord looked at the oilskin packet in Walt's hands. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Ivy with the expression of a man acknowledging quietly and without theater what he understood about what she had been carrying and why it mattered. "Yes," he said. Ivy crossed the yard to Cord. She stood in front of him and looked at him the way she looked at everything directly and without performance. She said, "There is a federal judge named Kane in Denver. The address is in the envelope. You tell him that Eleanor Finch started this and Ivy Marsh is finishing it. He will understand." Cord nodded. "Ride careful," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He was on a horse and on the south road within 10 minutes. They watched him go until the darkness took him, and then they went inside. The morning came slowly the way mornings come after long nights gray at first, and then gradually committed. Brand came at 9 o'clock. Not with men this time. Alone on a single horse, and beside him rode Judge Orrin Pell in his good coat with his white hair, and the document in his hand that Garrett could see from the porch was exactly what Walt had said it would be. Walt Greer stepped forward from the side of the cabin. Garrett had asked him to be there, and there he was. Brand looked at Walt. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly. The recalibration of a man processing information that changes the shape of the situation. Pell held up the document. "I have a warrant for the arrest of a woman known as Nora Kane or Ivy Marsh on charges of theft and fraud. I am instructing Deputy Greer to execute this warrant immediately and to take into custody any documents found on her person." Walt said, "I'm not going to do that, Judge." Pell looked at him. "The documents you're referring to are no longer here. Last night I sent a full telegraph summary of their contents and provenance directly to Federal Judge Arthur Kane in Denver. He confirmed receipt at 6:30 this morning and has suspended all local jurisdiction in this matter pending his arrival." Walt reached into his coat. "A rider left last night carrying the original documents. They are on the Denver road as we speak, and Judge Kane is already acting on what he has received." He held the wire where Pell could see it. The judge's face moved through several expressions. They were brief and quickly managed, but they were there. Brand sat on his horse and looked at the cabin and at Walt and at the wire in Walt's hand with the expression of a man doing final arithmetic on a transaction that was not going to balance. Ivy stepped out onto the porch. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at Hollis Brand directly in the full morning light, without the managed neutral and without the watchfulness. Just herself, whatever that was, whatever it would be now. She said, "I worked for you for 14 months. I balanced your books and organized your correspondence, and I did my job well. And for 14 months you were building something that destroyed people." She paused. "I want you to know that I did not take those documents because I was angry or because I wanted to cause you harm. I took them because they were the truth about what you were doing, and the truth needed to exist somewhere you could not reach it." Brand looked at her. For the first time since Garrett had met him, Hollis Brand had nothing to say. He sat on his horse in the cold morning light with his hat on his head and his coat buttoned and his hands still, and his face for just a moment showed something that was not strategy or management or the practiced performance of reasonableness. Something that looked, if you were watching carefully, like a man who understood what he had done and did not know how to carry it. Then the moment passed. His face reassembled. Walt stepped forward. What came next was legal and procedural, and in some ways the least dramatic part of everything that had happened, which was the nature of justice when it arrived in the company of paperwork rather than fire. Walt placed Brand and Pell under formal detention pending the arrival of federal authorities. He did it in the steady voice of a man who had rehearsed the words and intended to say them clearly and not stumble, which he did not. Brand did not resist. He dismounted when asked. He stood where he was told to stand. He looked for the first time in 20 years like a man operating inside the same set of rules as everyone else. Pell tried once to invoke his authority. Walt said with the patient evenness of a man who had decided things, "Judge, your authority in this matter has been superseded. I am asking you to dismount." Pell dismounted. Federal Judge Arthur Kane arrived the following afternoon on the southbound stage, a lean man of 60 with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that urgency and speed were not the same thing. He shook Walt's hand. He shook Garrett's hand. He looked at Ivy for a moment and said, "You have your mother's persistence, Miss Marsh. I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Ivy looked at him. "You knew my mother." "No," he said. "I meant Eleanor Finch." He reached into his case and produced an envelope, old and slightly yellowed, stamped in 3 places with the markings of his office. "This arrived in my office 5 years ago. My clerk at the time filed it under pending correspondence. He did not understand what it was. I did not see it until last week when your wire arrived and I went looking for anything connected to the name Brand." He held it out. "Eleanor sent this to me 2 weeks before she died. She had found my name through a federal record she had no business accessing, which tells you something about her resourcefulness." He paused. "She did everything correctly. The world simply wasn't ready to receive it." Ivy took the envelope. She did not open it. She held it against her chest the way a person holds something they are not yet ready to read but are not willing to put down. Garrett looked at the envelope. Eleanor's handwriting on the front, the same careful letters, a different address. 5 years and 200 miles and 1 misfiled piece of paper standing between justice and the woman who had tried to deliver it. "She was 3 days away," Garrett said quietly. Judge Kane looked at him. "She was, and you are here now, which means she was not wrong about the outcome, only about the timeline." Garrett stood on the porch and watched it happen. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about her on this same ground 5 years ago, seeing something real and telling him about it, and receiving the words "you worry too much" in return. He thought about the 9 words on the small folded paper that he had carried against his chest for 5 years without understanding them. He thought about what May had said. She saw things clearly. He thought about the envelope on May's shelf waiting for whoever needed it most, waiting, as it turned out, for exactly the person who needed it. He thought about 36 hours. He thought about the things that had happened in 36 hours that had not been possible before them. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the note. He unfolded it one final time and read it. "Do not trust Hollis Brand. He knows what I found." He held it for a moment. Then he folded it back along its lines. He did not put it in his pocket. He held it in his closed hand. Ivy came to stand beside him on the porch. They stood together and watched Walt and his men manage the situation in the yard with the unhurried competence of people doing a necessary and overdue thing. Later, after Walt had taken Brand and Pell to town, and Ruthie had made her notations and closed her notebook with the satisfied click of a completed project, and May had produced from her apparently inexhaustible capacity for timely food a lunch that asked nothing of anyone except that they sit down and eat it. Garrett went to Eleanor's grave. It was at the eastern edge of the property where a stand of young cottonwoods provided shade in the summer and a specific quality of afternoon light in autumn that was different from any other light on the ranch. He had put the marker there himself. He had carved her name into it with the patience of a man who wanted to do it correctly and understood there was no undoing it if he did not. He stood there for a while. He had the note in his hand. He had been carrying it for 5 years. He had carried it through the grief and the quiet and the fence checking and the 2 bowls on the shelf and all the Monday mornings of May's food and all the evenings of the wrong kind of silence. He had carried it because he had not known what else to do with it. He knew now. He folded it one more time and placed it at the base of the marker under a flat stone that would keep it there through the weather. He stood for another moment. He said quietly to the cottonwoods and the afternoon light and the 60 acres of pale grass and whatever else was listening, "You were right. You were always right. I'm sorry it took me this long to be the person you needed me to be." The cottonwoods did not answer. The light did not change. The grave was simply a grave, a piece of ground with a name on it, and the woman it marked was not here to hear him. But he meant it, and meaning it, he had come to understand, was not nothing. He walked back to the cabin. After a while she said, "What happens now?" "Federal judge arrives tomorrow," Garrett said. "Statements, proceedings. It will take time." "And after that?" He looked at her. She was looking at the yard, at the morning light on the grass, at the eastern trail that was empty and had been empty for the first time all week without the emptiness meaning something it shouldn't. He said, "That depends." She turned and looked at him. He held out the note. She took it and read it. She had known about it for days, known its contents, but she read it now as if for the first time with the particular attention of someone receiving something rather than processing information. She handed it back. He said, "Eleanor started something. It mattered. It took 5 years and a great deal of difficulty to finish it, and it got finished because of you." He paused. "I spent 5 years being the wrong kind of quiet. I don't intend to do that anymore." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to stay because I'm grateful," he said. "I'm not asking because I need someone. I'm asking because you fixed the barn board without being told. Because you made coffee before dawn without making a ceremony of it. Because you said I need somewhere that might hold and this place held, and I would like, if it's what you want, for it to keep doing that." The morning was clear and cold, and the sky was doing what Wyoming skies did when they had finished with their complications, which was to simply be enormous and blue and present. Ivy looked at the cabin door, at the porch boards under her feet, at the eastern trail and the creek and the cottonwoods and the 60 acres of short grass and pale dirt and the barn that still needed its final boards replaced. She said, "I have a federal proceeding to get through." "You do." "And I have been someone else's name for 8 months, and I have some adjusting to do." "That seems reasonable. And I need to tell you things I have not told you yet. About the 8 months. About before the 8 months." She looked at him. "There are parts of it I am not proud of." "All right. You don't know yet what they are." "No," he said, "but I know who told them to me." She was quiet. The morning held. From inside the cabin came the sound of May moving through the kitchen with her customary authority, and Ruthie's voice saying something to Thomas, and the small sounds of an inhabited place doing what inhabited places did. Ivy Marsh looked at Garrett Finch in the morning light of a day that had not yet decided what it would become. She said, "Then I'll stay." It was not an elaborate declaration. It was 2 words spoken by a woman who had learned to mean what she said and say only what she meant. But Garrett Finch, who had spent 5 years in the wrong kind of quiet and was learning the difference between that and the right kind, received them as what they were. 2 words that weighed everything. Inside, May said something that made Ruthie laugh. Thomas appeared in the doorway, looked at them both, decided nothing was required of him, and went back inside. The fire was warm. The sky was enormous. And Garrett Finch, who had spent 5 years learning the wrong lessons from loss, took a sip of his coffee and understood with the simple certainty of a man who has finally stopped waiting that this was what Eleanor had meant all along. Not to grieve her, to live.